Hey, it's Matt. Welcome to the DEQ Profiler Certification Renewal class. Today we're going to be talking about texturing, soil texturing. Now, during the initial certification classes, I sometimes hear the students refer to texturing as being subjective. You know, there differs from one person to the next. And I can understand this because when the process is first introduced, it's something that's new. They're not familiar with it. So to help explain that struggle that they're having with the texturing, they often refer to it as being subjective. So the question is, how do you remove that subjectivity with texturing? How have you explained to somebody that may be questioning this process altogether? You know, how do you legitimize the process of soil texturing? As a soil profiler, have you ever thought about that? Well, one of the best ways to answer those questions is by establishing confidence in what you do. A confidence that's not only supported by science, but it's rooted in practice and consistency, two of the basics of soil texturing. And remembering these basics will lead to or even build up more confidence in what you do and eliminate this perceived subjectivity of soil texturing. So now, watch this video about the basics of soil texturing.
What are basics? Basics are something that are fundamental or basic, essential ingredients, principles, procedures, etc. As programs are implemented, it's important to remember the basics to ensure long-term program success. The same can be said about soil profiles. In order to improve the process of soil profiling, we must remember the basics of soil texturing. As you will recall, soil texture may be determined either in the lab or in the field. In the lab, soil texture is determined by using Stokes' law, which is represented by this equation. In this setting, lab equipment is used to test hypotheses about water movement. Stokes' law is then applied and the results are the amounts of sand, silt, and clay. In the field, a process known as the texture by feel method can be used. This is the process of adding water to a sample, working the sample with your hands, and then making observations based upon what is felt. A representation of this process is this flow chart. So how exactly does the texture by feel process work? Once sands are eliminated, the texture by feel method allows for the identification of 3 different types of soil on the triangle based on a ribbon, which we will detail the ribboning later. The first types are the loams. The second types are the clay loams. And the third types are the clays. The texturing by feel process will lead the profiler to one of these 3 different types of soil on the triangle. You can see how these types correspond to the texture by feel flow chart. Then, the profiler will identify the specific soil within this type based on the feel when it's excessively wet. A soil group can then be assigned based on where it's located on the triangle. So to reiterate this process, texturing begins by slowly wetting the sample until it feels like moist putty and worked in the hand. Once the soil is worked, a ribbon is attempted by gently pushing the sample with the thumb over the forefinger. The ribbon that is produced will lead to one of the 3 different types of soil. Be careful about overwetting the soil when you add water. A sample that is too wet could cause inaccurate results. The soil will stick to your fingers and not produce a ribbon. So it's critical to only add enough water consistently to achieve the best sample. The next step is to excessively wet a small amount and rub it with your fingers. Do you feel grittiness? Is it smooth or neither? This overwetting will allow you to select the specific type of soil. It's even more of a description for the soil. A soil that feels gritty reveals a sandy type of soil. A soil that feels smooth reveals a silty type of soil. If neither are felt, then the soil without that sandy or silty designation is selected. So that's the information that we're going to use in demonstrating the texture by feel process. What we're going to do is add water and work the soil, ribbon the soil, and then excessively wet the soil. So now more detail about the ribboning. Now when we ribbon, we're going to be referring to the strength of the ribbon rather than the length. There are weak, moderate, and strong ribbons, and you can see how each one corresponds to the soil type. A weak ribbon is associated with the loam types of soils. This soil will not ribbon much before it breaks because it kind of feels fragile. A weak ribbon will bend over the forefinger, remain close to the finger, and may have difficulty staying intact. Most of these ribbons tend to be less than an inch in length. The clay loam types of soils will produce a moderate ribbon. This ribbon bends but still has enough strength to remain intact and extend out away from the forefinger. The clay soils will produce a strong ribbon. When the soil is pushed over the forefinger, it remains intact and has very little, if any, bend to it. These strong ribbons will usually be more than 2 inches in length. So let's demonstrate these texturing basics on the different types of soil, of which we'll do on all of them except for the sands and loamy sands. The first types of soils that we'll texture are the loams, which are the bottom part of the triangle. The first is a sandy loam. As this is being worked, you immediately feel and hear the grittiness of the sand. But the important thing to notice is the ribbon. This ribbon is weak and it bends right over the finger. So the weak ribbon leads us to the loam type of soil. When this one is excessively wet, you can definitely feel the grittiness. That sand is the predominant feel. So now we're further led to select the sandy loam soil specifically within this type. The silt loam will work up similar to that of the sandy loam, except it's going to leave your hand dirty and not feel as gritty. This one is soft and smooth. But notice, a weak ribbon is produced. When water is added and it's excessively wet, it feels slick or soft, so the silty loam would be selected. Now, loams can present a challenge when texturing because they fall right in the middle of the triangle. So what we'll do is we'll look at 3 different ones so you can see the common characteristics of the loams. Here is a loam with 11% clay and 50% sand. You may notice some grittiness from the sand, but it begins to disappear as it's worked. And common to loams, a weak ribbon is produced. Some sandiness is felt, but not enough to select that sandy loam. Now, here is a loam with 21% clay and 41% sand. And watch as this one is being worked and notice the ribbon on it. A weak ribbon is produced. When we add water and excessively wet this, you feel neither the grittiness nor the smoothness. It's a good idea to calibrate that with your known standards. Finally, a loam with 27% clay and 39% sand. This sample has quite a bit more clay than the samples before, but like all loams, it still ends up working the same. The amount of clay makes it feel harder to work initially, but we still end up with a weak ribbon. When this one's wet, neither grittiness nor smoothness stands out. Each of these loams have different percentages of sand and clay, but they have one common characteristic when texturing, and that is a weak ribbon, which leads to the loam type of soil. Now we're going to look at the clay loam types of soil. Clay loams are in the middle part of the triangle and produce a ribbon of moderate strength. Here is a sandy clay loam with 23% clay and 58% sand. Sandy clay loams have a gritty feel but still contain enough clay to produce that moderate ribbon. So notice as this one is textured and ribboned, that moderate strength is produced. So the moderate ribbon directs you to the clay loam types of soils. When a small amount is excessively wet, it feels gritty. You definitely feel it more than anything else. This grittiness gives you the information to select the sandy clay loam within the clay loam type. So let's look at some other clay loams. Here is a clay loam with 29% clay and 26% sand. Clay loams tend to be sticky when moist, so it's going to leave your hand dirty, but as it's worked, a moderate ribbon is produced. When you add water and excessively wet it, you don't feel either the grittiness nor the smoothness. It doesn't feel like either one. Now we're going to texture a silty clay loam with 28% clay and 12% sand. One of the first things noticed when working this soil is the lack of sand. You really don't feel any at all, but it does produce a ribbon of moderate strength. When you add water, slick and smooth is the best way to describe this one. So you get a moderate ribbon with a smooth feel. Here is another silty clay loam, but notice the increased amount of clay. Although it's a little bit more difficult to work, a moderate ribbon is still produced. Notice how it extends out from the finger, but still bends. So when you add water to this one, it also feels smooth. You don't feel any sands in there. So all soils within the clay loam types produce that moderate ribbon. Now we're going to look at the third type of soils, the clays that are found on the top of the triangle. Here is a silty clay with 40% clay and 17% sand. It's difficult to work. Now, watch the ribbon on this soil and compare it to the loams and clay loams that we just textured. As it's pushed with the thumb over the finger, there is no bend. This is a strong ribbon. The same happens when this soil with 45% clay and 15% sand is textured. It's very difficult to work, making your hand tired, but there's a noticeable strong ribbon produced. So the strong ribbon leads us to the clay types of soils. When these soils are excessively wet, they are very smooth and slick. In fact, you won't hardly feel any sand at all. So within that clay type of soil, we can select the silty clay based on the smooth feel. The texturing you perform can remain consistent and accurate as long as you remember the basics. We demonstrated a few basics of the texture by feel method. By remembering these basics, you can successfully identify the texture of the soil and the corresponding soil group. So let's review the basics that we covered. The first is that the strength of the ribbon will reveal the soil types that we're working with. A weak ribbon represents the loam types, a moderate ribbon represents the clay loams, and a strong ribbon represents the clays. The second is that the specific soil is revealed by what you feel or don't feel when you add a lot of water. A gritty feel represents a sandy. A slick feel represents silty. If neither stand out, then you select the one without the sandy or silty designation. The third is to practice or compare to your known samples. The known samples can do two things for you. One, you can practice these basics on the known standards and determine if you need to modify your technique at all. For example, you can excessively wet your known standards to get an idea as to what gritty, smooth, or neither feels like. And two, your test samples from the field can be compared to the known standards, providing both confidence and accuracy. That concludes this video presentation about the basics of soil texturing. For more information, please visit the ECLS website at the website listed on your screen. Thank you.